माननीय श्री हरदीप सिंह पुरी जी।
Honorable Deputy Chairman, sir. Sir, I was born 2 years and 2 months after our constitution was adopted. As India grew under the canopy of a protective constitution, so did my generation. The first to be born in independent India, for us the constitution is sacred. I cannot think of any occasion in my professional life, going back more than 50 years, which could even remotely rival the solemnity and the honor of being asked to speak in this august house to discuss the glorious 75 years of the Constitution. For this, I shall remain eternally grateful to the Honorable Prime Minister and the leadership of my party. Sir, this discussion must start with paying a tribute to the visionaries of the Constituent Assembly. They produced a constitution that drew upon our history, our culture, our civilizational experience of 7,000 years, ensuring that it was not overpowered by a mindset born of 190 years of colonial rule. The framers of the Constitution, therefore, sir, deserve our eternal gratitude. Democracy was not imported in India in 1947. India has had democratic traditions from way back to the 6th century BC in places like Vaishali, which was the capital of the Republic of Vaji. One of the oldest democracies, the mother of democracies. Our democracy, sir, predates the Westphalian order by a very long period. In the run-up to and after independence, there was no shortage of the prophets of doom, those who prophesied that India was bound to fail. The Honourable Leader of Opposition today recalled statements attributed to the then Prime Minister Winston Churchill. I have similarly come across a statement by Claude Auchinleck, the former Commander-in-Chief of the British Indian Army. He wrote in 1948, and I quote, "The Punjabi is as different from a Madrasi as a Scot is from an Italian. The British tried to consolidate it, but achieved nothing permanent. No one can make a nation out of a continent of many nations." So when I was going through this statement, I was reminded that this gentleman and Prime Minister Winston Churchill perhaps were the linear progenitors of the spiritual guru of the young leader of the Congress party, who prophesied that the young Sam Patroda. I am referring to the spiritual. I have not taken anybody's name. I have not taken, sir. I have referred to the spiritual leader, the enlightenment provider of a young Congress leader, who said, when it compared our diverse communities to foreign races, such prophecies were forthcoming even before we witnessed the horrors of partition. Going through the Constituent Assembly debates, it becomes abundantly clear that the framers realized what was at stake. This is what Sardar Patel had to say about the endeavors of the Constituent Assembly. He said, and I quote, "There is no alternative to this assembly except chaos and anarchy," unquote. Sir, despite all odds, India has succeeded. India has thrived, except for a shameful period of 21 months between 1975 and 1977. No other developing country, with the exception of Costa Rica, has seen a longer run of unbroken democratic rule since World War II. As a student of history and evolving political systems, one could say with a degree of confidence that the experiment of the United States was the defining moment of the 18th century for democracy, and India will be remembered as the exemplar of the 20th and 21st century as the largest, most vibrant, youngest, and most diverse democracy. We are diverse in terms of languages, cultures, customs, and tradition, but united by this Constitution, which helps us overcome the various centripetal and centrifugal forces that threaten to break the nation apart. Honorable Chairman, sir, when the nation was being targeted and was facing many challenges, the integration of princely states, some provisions were made which were meant to be temporary, transitional, and special provisions, thus underscoring their impermanence. Under such a provision was kept Article 370 in Part 21 of the Constitution. And I quote, "It can be garnered from the historical context for the inclusion of Article 370 and the placement of Article 317 in Part 21 of the Constitution that it is temporary provision." Sir, in a speech lasting over 1 hour and 18 minutes, the Honourable Leader of the Opposition provided advice, much of it gratuitous, and told us that we must go back to the debates in the Constituent Assembly. We must remind ourselves of what Baba Sahib Ambedkar and other members of the Constituent Assembly wrote and said. Sir, I would refer in this context to some advice that was given at that point of time by such stalwarts as Dr. Ambedkar and Sardar Patel. Despite vehement opposition, this special provision was included primarily because Sheikh Abdullah's demand for autonomy, supported by his dear friend, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. In a letter to Sheikh Abdullah, Ambedkar ji had warned him of the long-term consequences, and he wrote, and I quote, "You are offering wrong advice to Pandit Nehru." Sir, this is Ambedkar ji writing. "You are offering wrong advice to Pandit Nehru. By giving special status to Kashmir, you are isolating Kashmir from the mainstream of India. As a result, there will be no industrial growth or employment opportunities in Jammu and Kashmir. I will not be a party to your efforts." This was the only provision in the Constitution whose drafting Baba Sahib Ambedkar did not oversee. When the Constituent Assembly passed Article 370, then numbered 306A, Ambedkar stayed silent. Sir, even Sardar Patel was shocked at the leeway given to Sheikh Abdullah and his colleagues. In a letter to Gopalaswamy Iyengar, discussing Sheikh Abdullah's objections to the applicability of fundamental rights and directive principles of state policy in Kashmir, Patel wrote, and I quote, "You realize the anomaly of the state becoming part of India and at the same time not recognizing any of these provisions. Whenever Sheikh Sahib wishes to back out, he confronts us with this duty to the people," unquote. Patel then goes on to add sarcastically, "Of course, he owes no duty to India or to the Indian government. In these circumstances, any question of my approval does not arise." Madam, I have quoted both Baba Sahib Ambedkar and Sardar Patel only because the Leader of the Opposition, in a speech lasting 1 hour and 18 minutes, gave us gratuitous advice that we should go back to the writing of these stalwarts in the Constituent Assembly. I submit, Madam, that the Congress abdicated its responsibility to the Constitution with regards to Kashmir. And I say this with all emphasis. They betrayed the framers who inserted this article with the clear expectation, to quote Iyengar, quote, "that Jammu and Kashmir will become ripe for the same sort of integration as has taken place in the case of other states," unquote. Madam, what should have been a transitional provision ended up assuming a permanent character for nearly 70 years because the Congress lacked the courage to act. Article 370 was an anomaly, an aberration, a fracture in the constitutional body politic of India. It militated against the very idea of India. A land that holds special significance in Bharat's history, going all the way back to Rishi Kashyap, became almost alien to India after its independence. Its residents, some of whom trace ancestry back to the Vedic ages, did not enjoy the same fundamental rights that the rest of their countrymen enjoyed. they had no rights, no education, and no jobs. Madam, the SC/ST communities there did not enjoy benefits of reservation, and those provisions and laws did not apply to them automatically. The Honourable Prime Minister, whilst addressing the Lok Sabha, explained about how Article 35A, which was part of the legal architecture of Article 370, Article 35A of the Indian Constitution empowered the Jammu and Kashmir State's legislature to define permanent residents of the state and provide special rights and privileges to them which were not available to Indian citizens in general. Madam, it needs to be stressed that Article 35A was not included in the Constitution under Article 368. It was implemented quickly and quietly by a presidential proclamation in 1954 without being tabled in Parliament. Under the separate Constitution, permanent residents could purchase land and immovable property, vote and contest elections, seek government employment, and avail themselves of other state benefits such as higher education and health care. Non-permanent residents of the state, even if Indian citizens, were not entitled to these privileges. The provisions facilitated by Article 35A and the state's permanent resident laws were criticized over the years for their discriminatory nature, including the hardships imposed on immigrant workers, refugees from West Pakistan, and the state's own female residents who could lose their permanent resident status by marrying out of the state. The industry of brokers who claimed to be representatives of J&K enabled a culture of stone pelting and corruption. Government schemes remained unimplemented. We used to call Kashmir paradise on earth, but how many could even visit against the backdrop of constant terrorist activity? Sir, as a Foreign Service officer who was part of diplomatic missions to many countries, and I was also stationed in Geneva and New York, I would often see India's image get tarnished because of the Kashmir issue. Countries with terrible human rights records deign to lecture us. On 5th August 2019, President of India, Shri Ramnath Kovind ji, issued a new presidential order whereby all the provisions of the Indian Constitution were made to apply to the state without any special provision. This implied the state's separate constitution stood inoperative, including the privileges granted by Article 35A. Madam, it took the indomitable courage and resolve of the Honourable Prime Minister, Shri Narendra Modi ji, to abrogate this article of the Constitution, which, though intended to be temporary, was made de facto permanent by appeasement politics. Only Prime Minister Modi could have dared to do so. Before he took the final decision of 5th August 2019, many of the so-called representatives of the state had dared him, saying that if anyone even touches Article 370, aag lag jayegi. Leaders had tweeted, and I quote, long after the Modi government is a distant memory, either J&K won't exist or as a part of India, or Article 370 will still exist. This was regarded as inconceivable by them, and yet the Honourable Prime Minister demonstrated how this long-standing aberration was finally removed. Sir, what the Prime Minister did was truly beyond imagination. The BJP had declared the abrogation of Article 370 in their manifesto. Lots of preparations and consultations had been done before the actual historic decision, including field visits by many people who provided feedback, and that entire story will also emerge before too long. It was a very big bet, but we delivered, as it has always been part of our core philosophy as a party. Shri Shyama Prasad Mukherjee had said, you cannot have two sets of constitutions, one for one nation, ek rashtra, ek nishan, ek vidhan. With the abrogation of Article 370, Bharat has become whole again. एकीकरण ही नहीं, भारतवर्ष की संपूर्णता हुई. A historic wrong was corrected, and the country was finally united in body, letter, and spirit. The decision was also upheld by the Honourable Supreme Court and is now irrevocable. Madam Speaker, this historic action is already bearing fruit. Now every citizen of the 2 union territories enjoys his and her fundamental rights and receives myriad welfare benefits, including upward social mobility from reservation. The same Lal Chowk in Srinagar, which was once the hub of stone pelting, is now a vibrant public space. Tourism in the region has reached an all-time high, with more than 15% annual growth rate observed in the tourism sector in the last 3 years. Free and fair elections have taken place with an elected government now in place. Madam, the old stone pelting imagery of Lal Chowk also reminds us of dreadful refrain in the late 1980s and early 90s. Ralev Galev, Ya Chalev, which meant convert, die or leave. Subjected to genocide-like conditions, Kashmiri Pandits were forced to flee. Those who stayed were dragged out of their homes and ruthlessly murdered. There has been a lot of talk about the constitution being a Suraksha Kavach. Were these Kashmiri Pandits not a minority? Where was this constitutional shield then? Where was the Nyay when Kashmiri Pandits were hounded out of their homeland of nearly 5,000 years? Madam Chairperson, today the Congress Party, it says, portrays itself as the savior of minorities. But do they expect us to forget that they ran camps for forced sterilization of Muslim men in Old Delhi during 1976? In furthering their policy of divide and rule, like our colonial masters, the Congress engineered communal riots where so many Muslim brothers and sisters lost their lives. Did these poor people have no constitutional rights? My advice to the so-called defenders of the Constitution would be to realize that a sincere apology may serve you better than carrying unopened copies of the Constitution in your pocket. Madam Chairperson, from the preamble of the Constitution to Part 3 on fundamental rights, ample provisions have been provided to protect the interests of minorities. Our Constitution does not discriminate between citizens on the basis of religion. That is the position of the BJP as well, which regards all Indians as citizens and not as certain identities that can be manipulated, divided, or bought. Like the Honourable Prime Minister mentioned in his speech in the Lok Sabha, the Congress overturned the Supreme Court decision on the Shah Bano case because they felt it might appeal to the hardline elements of the Muslim community. They pandered to the revanchist and anti-progressive elements of the Muslim community. In reality, they failed our Muslim sisters and brought a regressive law which would not have passed muster in any Islamic country of the world as well. This was completely against the letter and spirit of the Constitution. To the Congress, minority welfare has just been a slogan of appeasement. For the Modi government, it is about inclusive development of every citizen. Facts speak for themselves. It was the Modi government which abolished the inhuman practice of triple talaq to offer a life of equality and dignity for millions of Muslim women. The Modi government has provided employment and self-employment opportunities to crores of minority communities. The minorities have immensely benefited from various schemes of the central government. Anywhere between 22 and 37% beneficiaries of the Mudra Yojana, Jan Dhan Yojana, Ayushman Bharat, Kisan Samman Nidhi, Ujjwala Yojana and the Swachh Bharat Mission belong to minorities. In some regions, up to 60% of the benefits have been received by the minority community directly. To those who suggested that the Constitution provides the Suraksha Kavach to citizens, I would ask them what the government did when 3,000 members of my community, innocent Sikhs, were killed in cold blood on the streets of Delhi. The then newly appointed Prime Minister made this callous statement, "Jab bhi koi bada ped girta hai, to dharti thodi hilti hai." What cold-hearted indifference with regard to constitutional values, the lives of thousands of Sikhs were equated to an afterthought. Sir, it fell upon the Modi government, madam, to provide justice to the families of the gruesome tragedy, including providing financial relief of 5 lakhs to each family and bringing the perpetrators to book. Their cases had not been pursued for many decades and were taken up after the Modi government came to power. Madam, I'm surprised how several members of the Sikh community in the Congress party continue to associate themselves with a party that desecrated Sari Harmandir Sahib, that also was responsible for the cold-blooded killing of 3,000 members of my community. On the other hand, when the government in Afghanistan, it was the Modi government that rescued thousands of Sikh brothers.
Sir. Please conclude. Your time
My
is up.
party is giving me time.
Please conclude.
It is the Modi government which started celebrating 26 December as Veer Bal Divas to honor the brave sacrifices of the Chote Sahibzade and the two youngest sons of Guru Gobind Singh Ji, who chose to be bricked alive by Wazir Khan, the Mughal Faujdar of Sirhind. Since we were talking about the treatment of minorities, I have with me a press report on an open letter that the Honorable Shri Nadda Ji, the President of the BJP and an Honorable Minister, wrote in 2022 on violence against minorities in Congress-ruled states. And I shall list from there Gujarat in 1969, Moradabad in 1980, Bhiwandi in 1984, Meerut in 1987, various incidents against Hindus in the Kashmir Valley through the 1980s, 1989 Bhagalpur, 1994 Hubli. The list of communal violence during Congress rule is long. Madam Speaker, this was an open letter which is on record and which I recommend be read by all members of the Congress party who try to lecture us on the treatment of minorities. The BJP has had a very different run and a very different approach, and BJP-ruled states provide ample evidence of that. I will try to now go a little forward to...
Please conclude.
I will conclude in a minute, ma'am. I have with me here a press report of February 1980, I think, which is about 40 years ago. Since we are talking about the Constitution and its federal structure, 9 state assemblies dissolved overnight. 9 state assemblies dissolved overnight. So Article 356 was used by that party 100 times, and by one particular Prime Minister more than 50 times. And since we are now ready to listen to some introspection, and we should, I have before me a book, PMO Diary, Prelude to the Emergency, and I will just read out what the author says in this book. The author was a very distinguished civil servant, Shri B.N. Tandon, Bishan Tandon, who served in the Prime Minister's office as a Joint Secretary, and he said, and I quote, "A cloud of fascism and dictatorship is hovering over the country. The Prime Minister will not flinch from anything to maintain herself in power. This could prove to be a big danger to our democracy. Individual liberties can be quashed." This is one of their own writing. And I want to conclude finally, ma'am. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition gave us gratuitous advice, including on the First Amendment, and he said we should go behind what is said. I did some research in the time between when he spoke. He seemed to say, almost in this nature, that what my senior colleague, the Finance Minister, said about the curtailment of the right to freedom of speech is not correct. I would suggest to him to read the first constitutional amendment bill in 1951, which has a clear intention to curtail the right to freedom of speech, whatever may be the reasons he quoted or what went behind it by the Honourable Leader. What was done was to curtail the rights, freedom of speech of citizens very clearly. In Article 19, they wanted a clause to give effect to this curtailment, and this is what they achieved. And the excuse being given today by the distinguished honorable leader of opposition was, they were made to do it because of the Supreme Court. You could have gone to the Supreme Court and say that democracy and freedom of speech is fundamental and you should be able to resist it. There are occasions when we are also asked by the Supreme Court to do things. We stand our ground when it is important.
Please conclude. Your time
There is a provision. I will make these papers available to you whenever you want. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.